Rich leads the strategy function for Veza. It includes driving long-term direction and key initiatives across products, go-to-market strategies, competitive positions, and marketing. Rich previously led product management across products like Okta from 2014 to 2018 through their IPO. He also led the product management team for data loss prevention from Symantec, several product startups, Vontu, Ironport, career and management consulting from Mitchell Madison, has PhD, and many other accolades. We're going to move along to make sure we get him up here. Quick reminder, I see a lot of you already going there. We didn't get a break this afternoon, but treats are over there, so grab something, a little blood sugar. And let's bring Rich to the stage. Today, we're going to talk about authorization, the new frontier of identity-first security for data.
My name is Rich Dandliker, and I'm the Chief Strategist at Veza. I came from the world of authentication, most recently from Okta, as my introduction mentioned, and that's really the world of authentication, of single sign-on, multi-factor authentication. But one of the things that I started to hear from customers was that authorization was an increasingly common request. Customers really wanted help with that, and we didn't have a good answer for them. So one of the things that really brought me to Veza, where I am today, is this realization that we're on a cusp of a new era, frankly, in identity-first security around authorization to data. And that's why I joined a company that's singularly focused on exactly this problem. But first, a little bit of just background for everybody in the room, the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication, making sure that you are who you claim to be, usernames and passwords. This is the world of SSO, SAML, OpenID Connect, and multi-factor. Authorization, usually the process that comes right after, gets down into the world of actions and objects, making sure that you know exactly who could do what on what object in the system. Right? So this is the world of RBAC, role-based access control, ABAC, attribute-based access control, and entitlements management. So when we think about the security industry more broadly, and we think about some of the common threats around ransomware, insider threats, supply chain attacks, and we think about what, the things that really get people worried, we look at what the core of that is. The root of that is really around privilege. It's really around looking at who has access, right? This is why privilege abuse is the #1 misuse threat that's identified in the Verizon breach report. And if you also look across these common threats like ransomware, and you talk to CIOs, you talk to CISOs out there, data really is the thing that people are most worried about protecting. That is the crown jewel. So you look at ransomware, data is exactly the target of that. If you listen to Mike Keene's talk yesterday about the Russian intelligence services, data wipers is really one of the pillars of the offensive capabilities that are being brought to bear in the Ukraine conflict, right? And then you also see on top of that, that some of the traditional responses aren't really that effective. Only 12% of companies are now paying ransoms, right? So there's not that many because people realize it doesn't work. About 60% of companies out there that are victims of ransomware attacks actually still experience a lot of lost data, either because their backup systems don't work as advertised as they expect, there's data corrupted, or they have gaps in the backup window. You can't just go and run backups. And then the attacks are getting more complex, right? We're starting to see that it's not just about encrypting the data, but they're also leaking the data at the same time. You start to see this because either the attackers want a secondary monetization, they want to raise the visibility of the threat, or they want to punish people who don't pay the ransom, right? So some of the traditional things don't work, and the attacks are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. We're even seeing places where attackers are very subtly changing the data. So you're not actually clear, and you don't always know how far back to go in your backup restoration to get to full data integrity. All right, so we look at this convergence. We look at privilege and data coming back together, and you start to see a common theme. That really is around authorization. It's really around being able to answer this question: who can and should take what action on what data? So more concretely, you can pick your favorite and most critical piece of data. It might be a customer database. It might be your source code. How do you protect that? Who has access to it? More importantly, who should have access to it? Another way of looking at this question is really around the principle of least privilege, right? We all know we're supposed to be doing that, but how do you actually operationalize it? How do you actually know what technical controls to put in place across your entire infrastructure? So let's take a little look at what the issue is today and how do you go about solving this problem. You really have to go all the way from identity down to the data objects. When you look at identity, it might be an employee, it might be a contractor, it might be a partner, it might be an external guest user, it might be a machine identity, someone coming in through an API or service account. You've got to link that to the group, which might be nested. You've got to link that to the role, which might be hierarchical. You've got to go through the policies. You've got to go into the system-specific permissions, and then down to the data object itself, because they might have an ACL on it that's specific to that end system, right? Then you've got to link it all together. And when you look at some of the common solutions out there, like IAM systems like Okta or IGA systems like SailPoint, the issue that you see is that these systems live in identity. They live in the world of users and groups and sometimes roles. But to actually understand what really the permissions are down at the data level, you're forced to guess. You have to hope that you're right. And so what makes this problem so difficult? There are three key reasons for this. The first is that you've really got to combine data from three different silos. You've got to go into the identity systems, the IGAs, the IAM systems of the world. You've got to go into the cloud native permission systems like AWS IAM or Azure RBAC, and you've got to go into the data systems themselves. Second reason, each of these systems just on its own is immensely complex. Identity systems. We regularly see the number of groups about 3 to 4 in a company. And these identities are sprawled across multiple systems. You look into the cloud native permission systems like AWS IAM, 100 pages long. The one for Azure RBAC is even longer. These things are amazingly complex. Going into the data linking in to data systems like Snowflake or SharePoint Online, going into infrastructure like AWS EC2, Azure Virtual Machines, going into apps like Salesforce and GitHub, custom apps that you might have built yourself via our open authorization API. Right, so I'd like to take a moment and really just reinforce that getting a common platform across all these systems is really a key part of the value proposition here, because each of these things has its own language of permissions, right? An expert knows what these permissions mean, but to find someone who actually can understand all these things, where all the data lives, you really need like a custom decoder ring to make sense of that. And for someone to actually reason about all these different systems and the permissions, these different languages side by side, it's extremely difficult. Then you can take this data that goes into the authorization platform, information that comes out, you can send it out to something like ServiceNow to actually make permission changes. You can put it into a SIEM like Splunk to actually combine it with other security data. And the other thing that's really valuable is then on top of this data platform, you can build different products to do different and solve different use cases. So two I'd like to touch on today. The first is search, the ability to see and visualize all these permissions. The second is an access and review workflow module. And that allows you to actually go through the compliance process of entitlement reviews. Let's touch on these in a little bit more detail. The first, as I mentioned, is just simply this capability to visualize permissions in the format of a graph. The benefit of this is you don't just see the end result. You don't just see, hey, who can do what on what, but you see how they got there. Because it's really critical to understand how they got the permissions in the first place. Is it just a single user who got permissions granted, just that one person? Is it from local permissions? Is the problem a group? Is the problem a role? Or did that permission Does it get granted by 10 different paths, each one of which you have to fix to solve that end problem that you solve? It's extremely complex, but a solution like this can actually give you a map to get there. Another way, another part of this I'd like to talk about is the access review workflows. This is actually one of the most common and popular ways that customers use Veza to actually find and fix problems in authorization that they see. Right? These three key capabilities here that you want to have. The first is the ability to manage down to the CRUD level, to create, read, update, delete on any of the systems that you're connecting into. The second is that you have to actually translate the permissions into something that a business user can understand. A lot of times, if you go deep into these systems, it's extremely technical. It's very hard to comprehend. And if you're asking a manager of HR or a manager of finance to actually go and do these business reviews, these access reviews, you have to put it and phrase it in a language they can understand to take action on. The third is you have to be able to delegate these workflows. You have to be able to, in the end, make this compliance process simpler, more targeted to the data, the thing you really want to protect, and make essentially a difference because you're already spending the time on compliance. Make it count. Right? This should be designed to help managers that are going through all the permissions of the reports. Might be for resource owners that are reviewing all the access of anyone who has entry into the system that they're responsible for, or for admins to review privileged accounts. Right? We all know that passing audits is a lot different than being secure. Right? So the core underlying message I'd like to leave you with here is this is really about taking the time that you and your teams already spend on compliance processes and make it count in actually securing the data. Okay. Now, this is a bit of an eye chart, but I think I really wanted to talk a little bit more about the use cases, right? Or about the ways that we see different teams being able to leverage authorization across the company. The first I talked about, security assurance, right? User access reviews. We've talked about that. But there's also identity and security engineering. They might be tasked with going out, finding and fixing instances of over-permissioning throughout the organization. You might have security operations that's reviewing permissions to look at the potential blast radius of a potential incident, right? Because just looking at activity logs, we all know that doesn't always tell the full story. It might be security or data architects that are trying to look, review, design, and validate that a new policy structure they put into place, maybe after an organizational change like M&A event, have actually taken root. Right? So those are the main ones. But we also see, if we think more broadly, there's a lot more that authorization can really do for a lot of different teams. It might be for data owners in this distributed data environment. We typically find that the tools available to these data owners are very sparse to be able to make intelligent decisions about whether someone who's requesting new data actually should get access to it. Now, wouldn't it be nice to know, hey, what else does this person have? If they're asking for customer data, do they already have access to customer data? Extremely powerful. In certain secure and highly regulated environments, you actually need to understand what the security posture is before you can deploy new cloud infrastructure. Right? In these kinds of situations, a product or platform like Veza can actually really help you accelerate the deployment of cloud infrastructure. In a DevOps-heavy environment, all these permission changes aren't being made on the production systems, they're being made in the IAC file, something like a HashiCorp Terraform file. Right? And so wouldn't you want to see and accelerate the whole process of managing permissions by being able to see the delta between your dev, your test, your staging, your prod environments? And finally, looking at the core problem of IT operations and provisioning new accounts or validating that new user access is allowed. Right? This is a critical piece, really understanding what their authorization should be before they go and provision new access. Right? So now we're starting to see really how fundamental and critical authorization is across the entire security and IT stack. So before I pass the baton off, I'd like to just spend a few minutes here to talk about some of the real world results that customers of Veza have gotten from a platform like this. Good example. A Fortune 500 software company actually found that they reduced the time by 86% to actually implement access certifications. company was able to reduce the overall footprint, the potential blast radius of their data infrastructure, and save hard dollar money, about over $1 million a year, just by seeing that a lot of those data assets weren't being utilized by users. Right? We have the largest alternative asset manager in the world, was able to set up a pretty large certification campaign of over 5,000 different entitlements in under 30 minutes. They really benefited from some of the automation that the Veza platform provided around auto-assigning reviewers. With that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's going to share a little bit more with you about real-world experiences in actually selecting, implementing, and using an authorization platform. The CISO of Bluecore, Brent Lassi.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I find it super weird to be dressed up. Is anybody else experiencing that today? Couldn't even find the right clothes to put on or anything like that, right? But here we are. Thanks for sticking around later in the day. I wanted to give some, like Rich said, some real world examples of what the boons of authorization could be and some of the challenges around it. I told Rich that this should probably be, he should have called his presentation that authorization is the new black, right? Because authentication has actually, I won't say it's gotten easy, but I think a lot of you would agree it's gotten a lot easier in the last, say, half decade for sure. Part of that's because of moves to the cloud, and a lot of the things I'm going to be giving examples are very cloud centric. And when you've got things like Google running your identity, or you've got Azure AD, or you've got some of these, sort of ubiquitous platforms like Okta, and you've got the emergence of SCIM, it actually is, and even MFA is relatively easy to set up these days. It's not, it used to be such a hassle. It's not anymore. And so now we need to go the next step down the stack. But I actually think authorization has gotten harder for most of us practitioners. And the reason is that the move, especially with the move to cloud, because when you have a data center that has literally physical servers and cables that plug into things, you actually create natural silos, right? Even in VMware instances and so forth like that, you're creating natural physical silos. And you're also creating barriers to entry, because if you can stand up, now I looked yesterday, I could stand up in Google Cloud a server with something like 72 processors and 800 gigs of RAM, and it would cost me hundreds of dollars, right? If you wanted to stand that up in your data center, it would cost you, what, I don't know. I don't even know these days. Right? I haven't set foot in a data center in 5-6 years. But the point is that every time you do that, it creates a natural silo. The clouds kind of remove those by creating a lot of empowered users who can kind of do whatever they want, which is where the authorization comes. You let them in the door, but then what, right? I liken it to if you're standing at the door of the Mall of America and you let a whole busload of teenagers in one at a time, and you're like, okay, you're on the list, you're on the list, you're on the list. The second they're inside, now what happens? Try to rein in a busload of teenagers in the Mall of America. It's not going to happen. This is the same problem. Lots of empowered users in the cloud, multiple clouds, and then within each cloud environment, a myriad of products that have their own APIs and their own authentication models, and automatically created service accounts, just crazy amounts of identities. How are you? I mean, Rich did a great job of making it clear how just difficult that is. And I had that exact same problem, right? So I figured, well, let's focus on authorization. Let's dig into it a little bit. In order to do that, you really need some modern technology to cut through the multiple, the very many orders of magnitude that get added every single time you add a new user, right? It's literally almost impossible to do it manually. So what I wanted was not just something that looked at users. I needed to make sure that assets, both data and compute, were included as well. Because if you don't have high visibility into your compute and data assets, then knowing what the users have access to, whether it be through a group or role binding or something like that, isn't going to do you much good. You've got to be able to build the real world, assess it, and then make a change that's actionable without breaking everything. And that's that's the thing that we always talk about, right? I mean, how many times have you not done something that should be a good security move because you said, I don't know what's going to break, right? The only way to know that is to be able to almost simulate it with the graph, right? So I went down that route, and what I found is when selecting a tool, I have a few rules that I tend to apply, and I would advise that you consider these when you're looking at ways to achieve this level of introspection into your authorization models. One, obviously, you got to be cross-platform and cloud-focused. That's a given. You need to have custom extensibility. At Bluecore, we're a Google shop, so we don't actually have multiple clouds. We just have the one, and everything's in Google. And if you've worked with Google Cloud, you know how complex their authorization model is. But lost my place. But we also have the actual Bluecore application, which stores its authorization models somewhere in Google Data Store. Right? I need to be able to plug that in. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to realize the full benefit of it. Right? And it's a custom solution. How do I determine that? Well, I'm going to need to use APIs. And so another tip is make sure the APIs are good. Actually test them. Right? Sometimes I think, oh, I ask somebody, I say, you've got APIs, and they say, yes, we do. I say, look at the list. I go, looks good. And then I go to use it, and it's a whole nother story, right? So I do advise getting in and testing APIs on solutions that you look for this for. Another one is consider the impact of having point-in-time entitlement reviews. I kind of like to upset auditors sometimes, and one of the things that I've been upsetting them with in the last few years is that rather than doing quarterly entitlement reviews or quarterly access reviews, I've went ahead and designed systems using things like Veza and other technologies as well in order to have an always-on entitlement review situation kind of going on. And so when somebody says, like, well, how often do you audit the SA access on your databases? I say, well, every 15 minutes, right? So, and they go, well, do you do a quarterly review? I go, why would I do a quarterly review if I do it every 15 minutes, right? Sure, entitlement reviews by human people are still important, but having an automated system that's actually constantly sort of kicking things in line and alerting you will be a lot more powerful. I have yet to find an auditor that told me that wasn't true, but some of them probably will. I mean, reviews that are scheduled are great, but if they are always on, I mean, aren't you really getting what you want in the moment? You want the security to be strong now, not once a quarter when you true it up, right? And so that's why I've constantly pushed toward things that say, somebody got in fact, I have an example of this. I'll get into it in a second. Setup, obviously, setup is always important. If you spend 2 months setting up a product, you wasted 2 months, right? And you also probably didn't realize the value of what you're spending money on. So make sure the things that you go and try to set up are going to get set up quickly. And lastly, and this is the most important thing, I've probably been saying this for, I don't know, 15 years now, and it has worked for me, is that if you cannot maintain the technologies that you purchase to do your authentication, your authorization, and so forth in-house, then your program is at a lot of risk, right? And the reason is because you constantly have to be finding new dollars in order to hire outside resources who might not even know what your objectives are in order to solve it. So the one thing I always say when vendors come in and say, hey, we want you to use our technology, I say, prove to me that my team can run this on their own, right? I mean, customer success is great and all that. I love great customer success teams, but make sure your teams can run this stuff on your own. So what kinds of benefits have I seen? The boons of a program like this can be actually a lot further than just security and compliance if they have that visibility into compute and also into data assets. So if you have visibility into compute and data assets, as well as all the people, you can get some interesting benefits. And one of them, Rich mentioned already, is that I was the one that got the $1.3 million in savings based on something that was being done within our data science environment. They had spun up something that was creating a bunch of extraneous BigQuery tables. And I noticed it in the authorization system because there was an explosion of the data assets. And I said, what's going on over there? And I asked somebody and they went, we don't know, we're going to go look into it. Somebody went around the data science team. The data science team said, well, that's just the way our system works. And we said, can you make it not work like that? And the first day that we made it not work like that, it saved $5,600. And everyone went, oh, it's just $5,600. It's $5,600 per day, right? It leveled out at about $3,600 or so, which comes out to something around $1.3 million of actual cloud expense not spent, right? And that was from looking at the authorization models within our database. So another one is I was able to track down some really esoteric issues within our production environment, because I got an alert that said that someone was added to our project that manages DNS for our environment. And I was like, why did they add this person? I don't think this person really knows how DNS works. And I certainly don't know how the mail environment works, because it was mail related. And I went and looked, and I found out that they'd broken it. And I found that out because of the authorization that was added to the DNS environment, to the DNS environment. So, you know, it's amazing what you can kind of track down when you have good vision into your authorization. Another one was that we hired a new engineering manager, and he was kind of cloned from another manager that was his peer. Fair enough, right? I was okay with that. It means we get the same access as the other guy. And then that day, I saw that every member of that team got the same access. Every member of the team of the new manager got like essentially ownership access in the cloud environment. And I went, what's going on? I called him within 15 minutes and said, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I just wanted to give my team access so that they have the ability to do all the things they need to do, right? But having good vision in that authorization. Within 15 minutes, I called him. He was a little bit nervous about that, to be honest, because he was kind of surprised that I was able to like get in his face within 15 minutes of him doing that. There are all kinds of things. Right now, I'm actually, the final thing I'll say is that right now I'm working on enhancing that entitlement piece that I mentioned. And if you have a really powerful authorization system, what you can do is sort of make entitlement reviews a tactical thing rather than this like thing you do strategically every year and then it sits on a shelf somewhere. I have the ability in my environment now to create an entitlement review on a specific little piece of, you know, whatever be some sort of some database or compute instance or a particular project within Google Cloud or something like that, and send it out to somebody in the organization. I can do that in about 5 minutes, right? And if they spend the 5 minutes to say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, then I kick it back over to an automation tool that actually removes that access. So you can make entitlement reviews something that actually get work done. And you're transferring risk a little bit, because what you're doing is you're saying, hey, manager of this particular technical group that I don't really know what they do and maybe don't understand all their stuff, can you make the decision about who needs access to this and who doesn't? Now, if it breaks, it's kind of their fault, right? Because they should know. So that's a bunch of use cases that that I personally didn't expect when I started really diving into authorization, and yet I got them, and I'm super happy about them. I mean, it's great to go to the CFO and say $1.3 million, right? That's a win. So, and I will. That's me. I'll turn it back over to Rich.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate your time and attention. And if you have any other questions, either come talk to us after this presentation here. You can contact us through the conference, or come by our booth, or come to Veza.com. Appreciate your time. Thank you.